Today we're going to be looking at Just Grace in people management, which is part of the wider series around accountability, faith and forgiveness at work. So I've been joining the faith and business calls for a couple of years now in the prayer sessions, and realized faith and business is not one to shy away from the tough topics. And I say this is no exception. So I'm really excited to hear from the two speakers. And just to introduce um, the specific topic today, I just thought of a scripture from John 1:17, which is that grace and truth came from Jesus Christ and came through Jesus Christ. I thought that could just help set the scene. There are other scriptures that are around that we've been praying about as well. And for me, that just really brought up the idea of forgiveness as a channel through grace, and also things like accountability and conflict resolution as elements of truth, and greater levels of honesty, trustworthiness, accountability, boundaries, all sorts of interesting things that we'll be exploring that I think, amongst other people, Jesus really modeled in some interesting ways. Just to introduce the speakers, so we've got Erouane, and Erouane is a serial entrepreneur. He has founded Entrepreneurs School. I've had the privilege of knowing Erouane for, gosh, probably more than 10 years now, and also been witnessing his journey. And he's a really inspiring character and also a good friend. So he's the author of Start Up the Leadership Way and Think Inside the Book. He's a speaker and he speaks a lot about entrepreneurship, and he always brings his fantastic faith insights into what he does. And he's got a real passion for ministry, a real passion for the youth, and empowering young people using business skills and entrepreneurship specifically. And he's currently living in Gabon, having left there about, what was it, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, from South Africa. So Ruth Adams is the other speaker that we've got lined up, and she's just joining us here. She grew up in Belfast during the Troubles, and so she's also been involved in ecumenical response to the bombings from 1998 and onwards. And she's got a master's degree in peace and reconciliation studies from the University of Coventry. And I believe at the moment is working as a here in the Diocese of Ely. And she's working as a mediator in disputes between organizations, as well as serving on the Bishop's Advisory Panel for Resilience and Conflict here in the Diocese of Ely. So we're really fortunate to have both of you on the call, and looking forward to hearing a bit more about some questions that I've got to pose to the two of you. So just to introduce myself very briefly, I am working at the moment in cybersecurity. I'm based in Cambridge, and I've been part of the faith and business community for a couple of years. Was lucky enough to join the retreat earlier in the year as well. And I'm actually going to be moving on from my current role into a more mission-based work in Africa. So that's just a little bit more about me. On to the questions, and we've gotten about, I think, 12 minutes for all of the questions that we've got. So we'll hopefully have a chance for each of the speakers to respond to the questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor, as it were, to everybody else to ask questions. So the first question is really about workplace culture, and then I think we could start with you, Ruth, and then have Erin respond afterwards. So the question would be, how do we create a workplace culture that allows for what we would call difficult conversations?
Thanks, Patrick. It's good to be here, to be with everybody. I've been around Cambridge for a long time now, 24 years, but it's my first time interacting with this group, so that's great. Thank you. I think for me, as a role as a mediator, I'm obviously called in when things go really badly wrong in an organisation. And the thing that I noticed, Patrick, is that the culture of the organisation has always had something to do with the escalation. So I'll quite often say to somebody who employs me, through this work, this crisis work, we're going to learn something about your organization. Is that something you want to hear about after we've finished the crisis? And mostly people, because they're good practitioners and they've called me in, will say yes. And usually, although the conflict itself is not necessarily to do with the organization, it's an interpersonal thing often, most often. Actually, the culture has played into or allowed the thing to get much more escalated than it needed to. And usually when you drill down into that, the thing about the culture has mostly been about relationships and emotional intelligence in the culture. So by that, I mean how much leaders, how much those running the organization are aware of their own emotional processing, how much they can self-regulate, how much they can self-differentiate, to like use in my language. So how much they navigate the space in between them and others, and they help their colleagues do the same. And I said, for me, obviously, I'm a Christian. I'm ordained as well, and I've come at my work primarily initially with churches and charities, although I have moved into other organizations. So in thinking about this kind of emotional regulation, I've thought a lot about that kind of axis that we operate on as Christians, which is our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. And actually that relationship in all things is a key building block, essentially, for anything else that we want to achieve. And when things have moved, we've all got different things within us. Some of us are more task oriented, and some of us are more relationship oriented. But unless we pay attention to that relationship side as a kind of first and foremost, I think that really it's a struggle to actually have a culture that is able to be honest, because people feel constrained, and once they feel constrained, of course, stuff builds up. They don't talk about it, and I mean, some slightly more specific things that have occurred to me around how you might create a culture that allows for difficult conversations. What happens in your contexts where something difficult comes up in a meeting, or a hard emotion is expressed? What do people do? How do you, if you're chairing the meeting, model the response to that? How do you go towards the person who's bringing it? Often in our culture, we tend to sit slightly awkwardly, as if a bad smell has been released into the atmosphere and we're not quite sure what to do about it. So how do we respond in love? But also, one of the big challenges is when difficult conversations come up, they feel sometimes off topic. So it can feel, particularly in conflict, which is the work I do, that actually it's a huge distraction from the point of the meeting. So you've got a meeting to do X, but this other person's bringing in something difficult from Y. So there's a real temptation to say, no, let's get back to what we're meant to be talking about. But the thing in the conflict transformation work I do, it's thinking about how do we create a culture where the thing that's difficult comes up, is also can help us to be evidence of transformation and opportunity for growth. So we go towards the difficult things not as a distraction or as an annoyance, but actually something that helps us to grow towards each other and to do what we're meant to be doing as an organization. So that's just a few things that have occurred to me there.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, it's really helpful. And Erin, what about you? How do you understand that culture for difficult conversations to take place?
Well, in my personal experience, and I've had the privilege of leading my own business, and also working at a church as a pastor, but also in various leadership positions. And I've got to experience both worlds, the marketplace and church. And one of the things that I've noticed that makes it very difficult to have hard conversations are personal problem. And I think Ruth mentioned a bit about that. So it's often related to our personal issues. And so whether it's in the context of the church or the business world, I've seen a lot of egos. It starts with egos. And to me, the solution is always top bottom. So it starts from the top. If the culture is right at the top, it filters through to the bottom. And when I say it's personal problems, that you talk about egos, you talk about insecurities, you talk about fear, and all of that leads to an atmosphere that is constipated. And so, how do we change that? I think, and I'll share a bit about my personal stories and how I've come to encounter all of this. I think it starts with a great sense of humility and understanding from the top, and that I'm talking about the leaders at the top, and I'm talking about myself being a head of a company. Understanding that all power is delegated from God. You are only a custodian. It's not yours. You might have started this organization, you might have done everything, but only by the grace of God are you able to be there. So I think there's a great sense of humility, and I've seen this in an organization, an American organization that I'm working with. They're working all over Africa. And you know what? Every time I talk to them and I say, okay, guys, with my business mindset, they're a nonprofit organization that spends multi-million US dollars every single year across Africa for missions and everything else. And when I talk to them and I ask them, how are we going to tackle this problem? Let's do the ABCDs. You know what they always say? Let us pray about it and let's ask the people that we lead what they think. And I'm so shocked. I work in a church, I work in a business. I've never heard people make decisions in rooms. They decide these are the ABCs that we're going to do. I've never heard anybody pose and go, hey, let's take the time to pray about this and see what God says. And let's involve the people that are going to be impacted by this decision. And I honestly sense such a great sense of humility from the leadership. I'm talking about the director of everything from the States. Like when I talk to him, he always goes, we're going to pray about it and see what the partners, which is everybody they work with, what they say. And I think, so top level, a great sense of humility. It's not your business, it's not your organization, it's God's, first thing. Secondly, we got to understand when it comes to our insecurities and fears, we are secure. There's too many scriptures in the Bible that talks about how secure we are in God. I bankrupted in 2016, and one of my teams told me I was a poor leader. The atmosphere at my workplace was very constipated. You couldn't talk to me. I couldn't receive criticism. And the reason for that was because I was highly insecure about my position, because I was 24, 25 years old, leading people that were much older than me. I was highly insecure. I was scared of what I was doing. And I was a Christian serving. I was ticking all the boxes of a Christian, leader in the church. Patrick used to tell me, dude, I look up to you. You are so good. And yet I was very insecure in my job as a business owner. And so as a result, from the top, it filtered through the organization. And so I realized, 2 Peter chapter 9 says, you are chosen. You are the royal priesthood. I mean, there's so many of them. Psalm chapter 91 goes, who will rest in the shelter of the Most High, will rest under the Almighty. We are secure. Do not be afraid, the Bible keeps on saying. And so our security does not come from what we do, or how much we build, or how much external success we experience. It comes from what the Word of God says. And thirdly, and I think Ruth mentioned this, emotional intelligence. Guys, I cannot emphasize this, emotional and cultural intelligence. We oftentimes talk to the people that we lead without considering where they come from, their background, their emotional traumas, and therefore there's a miscommunication that happens all the time, and we end up offending people constantly. And so I think it's very important from the top to have humility, to be secure in who God says we are and not our external success. And thirdly, have a high level and study emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence so we can speak to people from where they come from and not from what we believe. And I'll finish with this. When Jesus came to earth, he didn't come as God. He came as a Jew because the people that he came to speak to were Jew. He spoke the language they spoke to. He completely contextualized himself to the people he had come to minister to. And so I want to believe that for us to create an environment where conflict can be resolved, we have to be able to contextualize ourselves within the culture of the people we are leading and where they come from.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's really really interesting hearing that first-hand account from a business leader, sort of entrepreneur, and someone who's been responsible for others, and this sort of perspective of God as the sort of business owner, as it were, and therefore the authority stemming from him. It's really helpful. So I think in the lead up to a follow-up question that I've got, I've actually want to ask a bit more about exercising accountability and enforcing discipline. Personally, I've had an experience of this, which is still a bit raw, quite recent in where I work, where one of my team, who is actually a believer, was very difficult, and it became a situation of escalating internally with HR to the point where he was actually summarily dismissed for gross misconduct. And for me, this was really tricky. I brought him on. He was a young guy, a believer. We were actually in a prayer group together at work. So I've sort of seen this in the near recent past firsthand, where accountability and discipline had to come in. And it was then a case of bringing HR, getting them involved, and trying to stay objective. Because in that sense, I felt like, oh, I was wearing the hat of manager, but also wearing the hat of an older Christian at work. So I did feel there was a bit of a conflict there, but with the HR piece, it felt very much like, oh, this is a level playing field. Here's quite an objective set of criteria to base one's, in this case, behavior management and work management off. And so I'm just interested in hearing from both of you, and maybe we can land it back to you, Erin, and then pick up with you, Ruth, about, yeah, how do you see exercising accountability, discipline, within your workplace specifically, and have you got some stories or some anecdotes to share around your experiences?
Thanks for that, Patrick. I think the question is over to me. Is it me or is it Ruth? Ruth, is that you? Oh, it's me. So when I bankrupted, let me answer from a personal point of view. When I bankrupted in 2016, one of the I went to my team members and I asked them, what are some of the things that I did wrong? And they said, first of all, I was a sore leader and I couldn't be spoken to. And then I did a lot of introspection and realized my business partner was my closest friend, and myself were the only people sort of on top. And I could make a decision to fly to any country I wanted just because I could. And that's one of the many reasons that led up to the bankruptcy. And one of the core things is that I had no accountability, right? Because when I took a decision to travel anywhere I wanted to for a holiday, I could justify it however I wanted to. Who was I accountable to, right? And it stems from the fact that God is a business owner. I'm only a custodian, and I wasn't a good manager of the resources He had given me, and I had no accountability, no one to check in and actually call me out about my decisions. And so, from that point of view, I think it's important to realize everybody needs to be accountable. My wife and myself have been in Gabon for about 9 months now from South Africa. We've joined a local church, and I have been on a hungry search for someone to be accountable to. Because I know the importance of that. And I'm going to go into a few practical tools. But another example is when Jesus came, and Jesus didn't need accountability, but it's crazy that before starting his ministry, he surrounded himself with the 12 disciples, and he did life with them, and they could see what he was doing. And I believe Jesus was accountable to the disciples, and not because he needed to, because he wanted to model the concept of don't do life alone, don't do it on your own, have people to check up on what you're doing. And so I think it's biblical to have accountability. Yeah. And now, secondly, how does it work in a workplace? I think it's important to understand when there's conflict in a workplace, and when there's a need for accountability, that reconciliation, and I'm going to say this slowly, reconciliation is more important than being right. To be reconciled with a colleague or with a partner or with your team is more important than being right. Now, I'm going to talk to all the men out there. We love being right. We love fixing things. I'm a fixer. I'm one of you. We're part of the League of Fixers. And we're very factual. And women are a lot more in tune with their emotions and a lot more emotionally savvy, in my opinion. And so for the men out there, it's very important to know being right is not as important than reconciling. And reconciling means we're going to find a way to move forward despite our differences. That's very important. And I will use, once again, I love going back to scriptures and go to, we were in open rebellion with God, right? You look at the Garden of Eden. We sinned, and all of us have fallen short of that mistake. What did God do? He was fair because he had said to them, when you eat of the apple, you'll surely die. So there's a consequence to our actions. We can't just be Hakuna Matata, Kumbaya, everything flies. There need to be consequences, but we got to add an extra touch of grace into that. So eventually Adam and Eve will die, but God takes the time to clothe them and put a promise over their head and says, your child one day is going to redeem. He says to Eve, you are going to have a seed, and that seed is going to crush the head of the snake. So your child is going to redeem. And so what do? When we're in open rebellion, reconciliation has to be more important. And secondly, we got to do what's just and what the law says, but we got to have grace into that. And what does that look like? Hey, listen, what you did is wrong. Even if you're getting fired, what you did is wrong. However, I'd love for you to approach this organization because if they help you with this kind of problems, and I really want what's best for you for the future. So I think it's a balance in between that makes it work in the workplace.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. In fact, that's made me think, oh, maybe I should reach out to this guy that we just let go, and just say, hey, look, I hope there's no bad blood between, or no bad feelings. I might need to pray about that a bit more personally, but it's really helpful, that idea of reconciliation, because you don't really want to leave these wounds unhealed, especially in a faith context, in that case. So yeah, thanks. And Ruth, what are your thoughts, understandings on this, the same question, accountability and discipline? And also, I think we could lead on from there. Maybe you could speak into this question of power as well. So how is power used in the Bible? Can it be abused? If so, how? And what are the warning signs? And how can we also work in contexts where there's maybe a power imbalance to act responsibly and justly?
Okay, thank you. I'll have a go at all of those. So the two words, Patrick, that are sort of were coming across as Erouane was talking, were words that as a mediator I particularly use. Obviously, as a mediator, I can't use specific examples, but there's a particular thing that happens in pretty much every mediation, is that one person will be talking about the impact that something has had on them. So they'll say, when this happened, this, and this is how I felt. And the other person will say, but that's not what I meant. So they'll be thinking about what their intention was the whole time. And so the conversation literally goes like this, because there's one person going impact, 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 and the other person going intention, 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 and they're not having the same conversation. They're complete cross purposes. I think when we're constructing any kind of disciplinary system or decision rule, whatever that is, it obviously has to be fair. It also has to be, it needs to be clear, etc., etc. But I think we also be really good to think about, and that's what we were getting onto towards the end there with Erouane and yourself, is what is the impact of this going to have on people? So what would it like to be a person who's been taken through this particular system? If I was in their shoes, what would it look like? We have a thing we do as facilitators. I imagine many of you here have done it, where in a meeting, if we know we're not hearing from somebody, we put out an empty chair and we say, okay, so who are we not hearing from here? And often my experience is actually in the systems we create for kind of disciplinary, we don't necessarily think about what it might be like to be the person who's being disciplined. We think about being the disciplinaire, and obviously it's a very arduous, quite difficult, stressful situation to be in. But I think the companies, and the organizations that I've seen have a conflict transformation, it's not so much necessarily, as you say, about the outcome. The person may still need to move on to a different situation, but it's about actually how they feel about how they've been treated. What's the connection been with them? Has it been fair? First of all, has it been clear? But also, has there been a sense of actually them being a person? And the whole of who they are being important to the organization.
Just on that, Ruth, I had an interesting experience with this. There was actually a sort of hearing, and one of the questions I had to ask as part of the hearing was, do you feel like you've had a fair hearing? And I found that really interesting from the HR input on that. And if the answer is yes, hopefully they've not been coerced into that answer. But that is some sort of literal indication, and it never would have occurred to me to actually ask that question to the person up front.
Thank you. Yes, and so then to move on, I think, Patrick, to your second question around power, I think it links for me. So my kind of biblical understanding of power, there's always lots of different things about power in the Bible, But when I'm particularly talking with clergy and training clergy, one of the things we find ourselves talking about a lot is what was Jesus's attitude towards power? How did he use his power? And I think in our world, power is generally seen as a zero-sum thing. You either have it or you don't. And if I take power, then you lose it. But actually, Jesus is an empowerer of others. So with Jesus, power gets bigger for everybody. Jesus uses his power to free people, to allow them to have fullness of life. So I think as Christians, we are called to use the agency and the power we have to empower those around us. And that will include actually in the systems we're setting up, and that might include like your question to this person, like, how are you now? Can I give you some agency? Because often people will lose agency. I think that's a profoundly Christian view of power. And quite a lot of the work, particularly that's been done by conflict transformers, particularly like in places like South America, has been around galvanizing communities through sharing power. And not with a sense of loss, that to share our power doesn't mean we then lose it, because we're always going to have positional power or different types of power, educational power. But if I give some to you, then we both have more. and so it's a kind of a kingdom view of power. I had a colleague who used to talk about, we don't live in God doesn't have a scarcity economy. It's an abundance economy. And so having that as an attitude helps us to go into the difficult situations, not feeling like we're always going to lose something, which is sort of a different mindset, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks, Ruth. I think that's really interesting. The agency question certainly gives people the opportunity to express themselves and what's going on, and to acknowledge maybe that asymmetry of power, for example, in a disciplinary or a situation, or even a difficult conversation, because otherwise it could be quite unwieldy, potentially, that the person with the power is essentially using that, lording it over someone who doesn't, and not, as you've spoken to, understanding where that person's coming from, due to a mismatch of maybe outlook, trajectory. I just see that we've actually gotten a question or two in the chat, so let's just address these if we may. We've got Marjorie, who has asked how formal, difficult conversation would be different if we interpret disciplinary more to the concept of learning. Oh, that's wonderful, beautiful. Yeah, so a disciple literally means a learner, right? So Ruth, Erin, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a mutuality around discipleship, isn't there? Yeah. So when you see the disciples talking together, and when we think of each other as co-learners in education, the sort of idea of lifelong learning, isn't it? Where the teacher is also learning alongside the pupil. So it's probably linked to that. If you're learning together how to be a better organization, yeah, discipleship sounds like quite a nice way to because, as I say, sort of the leveling there is probably helpful. There's some mutuality. I'm always looking at any conversation I do to what is the Venn diagram between these two people? What is the stuff that's shared? Let's talk about that. And discipleship probably helps with that.
Yeah, discipleship's very mutual, isn't it? Because it's a willingness from the disciple to engage with the one discipling, presumably. And so there's that mutual agreement, as it were, whether it's tacit or not, that like an employee contract, really, but different.
Yeah, and when I think about that, I think it's very, very important. I said it once again, top-bottom approach. Look at this meeting we're having right now. The tone is set by Stephen, by Patrick, because they're sort of the guys leading this, and by Peter. And so the level of energy in the room and everything will be dependent on the tone that you guys set. So if you want an atmosphere of learning, then the person that is organizing that need to approach from that perspective. There need to be so much, the key word here is humility. There needs to be so much humility. I remember I had a client once, back in the days when my business was still starting, and we had a massive conflict. I mean, massive conflict. And because I'm a fixer, I found a way to fix. I tried to fix it, couldn't fix it. I did the research on the proper procedure to fix it. I'm talking about international standards. Shared it with the client and said, "Listen, I followed all the steps here." She was still not happy, and this was a believer. We went and sat down with. Eventually, went all the way to our local church, which I think is always it should be the first step before going to court and all of these other things, especially when you're talking about fellow believers. And the Bible does encourage us, to see the elders in the church. So we went to see our pastor, and I love the way she addressed it. She, and you would know her, that's Tammy, and it's okay. She'll be okay with me sharing this. And she sat down, and she didn't sit down as the all-knowing person. She wasn't the big old pastor that everybody or clergy or that everybody need to be scared of. She sat down and she was the most human person I've ever encountered. There was no, it was a very horizontal kind of relationship and conversation that we were having. And she asked a lot of questions in all humility and very respectfully. So, and how does this make you feel? That's how it went. Sorry, I'm not sure I understand this, but can you paraphrase what you think Aaron is saying? And it was this back and forth in between us, and I had this righteous rage about me. I'm like, I have followed all the right steps. Listen, I'm the one who's right here. And she was just like, but let's understand where she's coming from. And when I spoke to her later, she said she was very frightened about this meeting. She hates confrontations, but she was so brilliant at it. But it started with the way she sat us down and the humility she had in understanding this is a difficult thing for both of us. So I think once again, whoever is in charge of carrying on the disciplinary action has to be able to create the atmosphere where there's a learning platform for everyone. And I'm going to leave you with this passage just on this question. I think it's going to strengthen everyone. And I'm going to read from Isaiah chapter 58. And I'm going to read a bit slowly, but I really want you to pay attention because it blew my mind this morning when I stumbled onto it. And it said, this is the Message version, right? It goes, shout, a full-throated shout. For those that have the Bible, you can go to Isaiah 58, the Message version. Tell my people what's wrong with their lives. Face my family, Jacob with their sins. They are busy. Talked about the business people, the employees and all of us. Listen to this. They are busy at worship and love studying all about me. To all appearances, they are a nation of right living, law abiding, God honoring. They ask me, what's the right thing to do? And love having me on their side. But they also complain, why do we fast and you don't look at our way? Why do we humble ourselves and you don't even notice? Well, here's why. So God is not answering, why? Why is he not answering? The bottom line on your fast days is profit. You drive your employees much too hard. You fast, but at the same time, you bicker and fight. You fast, but you swing a mean fist. The kind of fasting you do won't get your prayers off the ground. Do you think this is the kind of fast day that I'm after? A day to show off humility, to put on a pious face and parade around solemnly in black? Do you call this fasting? And then he goes on to say, this is the kind of fast I'm after, to break the chains of injustice. Somebody mentioned that earlier, I think it was Ruth. To break the chains of injustice, get rid of exploitation in the workplace, free the oppressed, and cancel debts. There's such a sacrificial thing that God is asking us in the workplace. He says you are fighting, but at the same time you're praying, you're bickering, exploiting people. That's not the kind of life God has called us to live. You really want a sacrificial life. That means what? We're going to cancel the debt. We're going to forgive. We're going to put justice at the center and all of that. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to share.
Thanks. That's fantastic passage. I think it really speaks into what we're considering here. So at this point, it's a good time for us to move into our breakout rooms. And just before we do that, just by means of summary, I think essentially, just to recap, we've looked a little bit at what is a difficult conversation in the workplace. What could that look like? We've looked a little bit at how that relates to accountability and things like discipline. What does discipline really mean? And also power, and how is it exercised? What are the effects? And some key takeaways for me, I think, from this have really been, for example, this idea of intention and cross purposes. What's going on in these difficult conversations? Are we actually connecting, or are we operating at cross purposes? Things like power sharing, agency, checking in, making sure, looking to reconcile, looking for opportunities to exercise humility, how leaders set the tone in the organization. They need to understand their authority is actually coming from God ultimately, and even the idea of the practical things, praying before taking action, and so much more.